The floodlights caught the scar first, a raven shape, wings spread, burned into his forearm as he wrenched a man off the chain-link fence between us. Not the gun someone was holding. Not the shouting. The scar. I'd traced that exact shape in memory for 10 years. 3 weeks earlier, I didn't know his name. Victor Renzi called it a mercy, one signature, and the Corvo family would forgive every cent of the $400,000 my father never should have owed. He didn't mention that the man collecting on it would look at me across the signing table like he already knew my face. I remember thinking that was strange. I didn't know why yet. If you've ever recognized someone before your mind could explain why, you already know the feeling that hit me first, before I even understood I should be afraid. I keep my father's books for a living. I read contracts for the lies hidden in their margins. I just never expected to find one written on a stranger's skin. If you've ever watched someone you trust set something in motion and had no idea until years later that you were the thing being moved, tell me where you're watching from. I want to know I'm not the only one. My father's freight office smelled like diesel and old paper, and it had smelled that way for as long as I could remember. 9 years ago he'd borrowed against it to survive a bad season, and 9 years later the debt column in the ledger hadn't moved. Not really. I'd redone the math myself a dozen times, quietly, at night, convinced I was missing something. I never found the mistake. I just found the same number, over and over, sitting there like a tide that never went out. Victor Renzi had drawn up that loan. He'd been coming to Sunday dinner since before I could walk, closer to my father than most of our actual relatives. Close enough that I called him uncle for the first 11 years of my life before I learned better. He wore kindness the way some men wear cologne, applied carefully, reapplied often. The night Renzi came with good news, my father's hands were shaking before he even opened the door. The debt's been bought, Renzi said, settling into his usual chair like he did this every week. Whole balance. One buyer. Who? My father said. Not a question. A demand dressed as one. The Corvos. Renzi said it gently, like a doctor naming a disease he already had the cure for. And there's a way to close it clean. One signature. A marriage, not a payment plan. He looked at me when he said it, the way you look at furniture you're deciding whether to keep. My father went the color of the ledger paper. I didn't argue. I want to be honest about that, because it would be easier to tell you I fought. I didn't. I had spent 9 years watching my father's shoulders get smaller under a number I never got to see the paperwork for, and here was a way to make the number disappear. I told myself I was choosing it. I have wondered since whether choosing the only door in the room counts as choosing it all. They took me to a Corvo warehouse on the harbor to sign it, a long room that smelled of salt and machine oil. Damiano Corvo was already at the table when I walked in, dark coat, dark eyes, a stillness that made the room feel like it was holding its breath around him. I had braced myself the whole drive over for a monster. I got a man who barely looked up from the contract, who signed his name in a hand so controlled it looked engraved. Then he rolled his sleeve to steady the page, and I stopped breathing. A scar, raven-shaped, wings spread wide across his inner forearm, old, silvered, exactly where I remembered gripping a stranger's arm with both hands while glass rained down around us. I told myself scars aren't fingerprints. There are 100 ways to get a scar shaped like a bird. I told myself that the whole drive home, and I didn't believe it once. I'm telling you this the way it actually happened, one wrong detail at a time, not one big reveal. If stories like this keep you up wondering what you'd have done, Raven Vow is where they live. Subscribe, and stay for the rest of mine. His household ran on the kind of quiet that isn't peace, just training. I learned the shape of it fast, which hallways the staff used, which doors stayed locked, how his second, a broad, watchful man named Bruno, positioned himself in every room like he was still deciding if I belonged in it. At dinner one night, testing something I didn't have words for yet, I mentioned that I used to live near the coastal road north of the harbor. Just that. Not an accusation. Barely even a sentence. Damiano's fork stopped moving for exactly 1 second too long. "Bad road and weather," he said, and reached for his water glass like the subject was already finished. 4 words. I'd have missed it if I hadn't spent a decade learning to notice what people didn't say. That night, unable to sleep, I went looking through a box of my father's old files for an insurance document that had nothing to do with any of this, and found, instead, a police report from 10 years ago. A single-car accident on that same coastal road. A witness who'd pulled the driver clear before the car caught fire, then left before anyone could get his name. Case closed, no further leads. I sat on the floor of my father's office at midnight, the box lid still in my lap, the smell of old cardboard and dust thick in my throat, holding a decade-old piece of paper, and felt something in my chest that had no business being hope. I remembered the accident the way you remember weather more than facts, the cold of the guardrail under my hands, someone's coat around my shoulders that smelled of engine grease and cedar, a voice telling me not to look back at the car. I had never once, in 10 years, connected that voice to a name. I hadn't had one to give it. The next morning I did the only thing I know how to do with fear, I turned it into arithmetic. I asked to review the settlement paperwork myself, told everyone it was habit, not suspicion, which was almost true. I spread every page across the kitchen table the way I used to spread my father's invoices, checking totals against totals, dates against dates, the way you'd run your thumb along a seam looking for where it had been resewn. I found it on page 11, a balloon payment clause, added a full year after my father's original signature, in ink that didn't match anything else on the page. The authorizing signature wasn't my father's. It wasn't a Corvo signature either. It was Victor Renzi's. A hand I'd seen on 100 invoices without ever once really looking at it. I didn't tell anyone. Not yet. You don't accuse the man who's sat at your family's table for 10 years on the strength of one signature, not without being sure, and not without understanding what it would cost my father to hear it. I told myself I had time to be sure. I didn't. 3 weeks into the marriage, a Corvo shipment was hit at the exact transfer point on the harbor road, a detail only 4 people had known in advance. I was one of them. I felt the shift before anyone said a word about it. Bruno stopped calling me Mrs. Corvo. He started calling me the bride, and he said it the way you'd name a stain you were still deciding how to clean. Staff who used to nod at me in the hallways found reasons to be somewhere else. The house, which had never felt entirely mine, started to feel actively unfriendly, every closed door suddenly a decision rather than a habit. Damiano asked me, flatly, over breakfast, where I'd been during the transfer window. There was no accusation in his voice, which somehow made it worse. He was asking the way you'd ask anyone, which meant, for the first time since the signing table, I wasn't anyone to him. I was a variable he hadn't ruled out. I remember thinking, absurdly, that I would rather he'd shouted. Shouting would have meant he still cared enough to be wrong about me loudly. I had no one to vouch for me. I had been exactly where a wife with nothing to hide would be, alone, in a house that wasn't fully mine yet, doing the books for a business that wasn't fully mine either. If you've ever needed someone to believe you and realized, mid-sentence, that you don't actually have any proof, you already know the specific kind of cold that is. 3 nights later, Bruno's men found me in the loading yard after dark, checking a shipment count that didn't need checking. I told myself I was being useful. I think some part of me was hoping to be seen doing something honest. They didn't touch me. They didn't have to. Two men closing a half circle around you in a floodlit yard is its own kind of pressure, the kind that sits on your ribs and makes your breath come shallow and fast, the kind where you catalog exits the way you'd catalog line items, quickly, quietly, without letting your face show the math. "Where were you Tuesday night?" one of them said. Not a question either. Everyone in this family had learned that trick from someone. I opened my mouth to answer and nothing came out steady. Then Damiano's voice, low and even, behind me, "Let her breathe before you ask her anything else." 10 words. Nothing more than that. But the cadence of it, the exact, unhurried weight of it, went through me like a struck bell, and the memory I'd been half refusing to believe for 3 weeks arrived whole and undeniable. That same voice, that same steadiness, telling a 17-year-old girl with blood in her eyes to breathe, to stay with him, to not look at the fire. "It was you," I said, before I could decide whether saying it out loud was safe. 10 years ago. "It was you." He didn't answer. His silence was its own kind of confession, and for one unbearable second the floodlit yard, the men, the shipment count, all of it fell away, and there was only the fact of him, finally, fully seen. He sent his men away with 2 words I didn't catch. Then he stood there, not moving toward me, like he was giving me room to decide whether I wanted him closer. "You knew," I said. "At the signing table. You knew who I was." "I wasn't certain," he said. "Not until you saw the scar and stopped breathing. I've spent 10 years wondering if the girl on that road survived the year, let alone found her way into my own signing room by way of a debt I didn't even know was fraudulent. We ended up in the estate's old greenhouse an hour later, because it was the only room in that house that didn't feel like it belonged to anyone's business. Glass walls, damp earth, the specific green smell of things still growing in a family that mostly dealt in things that didn't. I was angrier than I expected to be. Not at the marriage. At the not knowing, at Renzi's decade of quiet management, and now at this, a husband who'd recognized me and said nothing, who'd let me spend 3 weeks married to a stranger who wasn't actually a stranger at all. "You could have told me," I said. "Any night. Any dinner." "And said what?" His voice wasn't defensive. It was tired, in a way I hadn't heard from him yet. "That I've thought about a girl I pulled out of a wreck more than I've thought about almost anything else in 10 years, and then found her sitting across a debt settlement table, and didn't trust myself to say so without it sounding like a claim I hadn't earned." I didn't have an answer for that. I still don't know if there is one. "You should have let me be angry at you properly," I said, and it came out smaller than I meant it to. "Instead of angry at a stranger who turned out to be you the whole time." "You can still be angry at me," he said. "I'd rather that than the version where you never find out at all." There was a long quiet after that, filled only with the drip of the greenhouse's irrigation lines and the distant sound of the harbor beyond the estate walls. I found myself studying his hands instead of his face, the same hands that had steadied a contract without shaking, that had, a decade ago, pulled a stranger's daughter out of a burning car and never once come back to collect on it. 10 years, I said, and you never tried to find me." "I told myself finding you would be for me, not for you," he said. "A girl who survives something like that doesn't need a stranger showing up to remind her of it." I was wrong about a lot of things. I don't think I was wrong about that. What I know is that we stood in that greenhouse a long time, not touching, both of us finally admitting the same quiet, ridiculous fact, that whatever this marriage had started as, it had stopped being only a transaction the moment I saw that scar, for both of us, at almost exactly the same second. We were still standing there when a member of the household staff came to say Victor Renzi wanted to see me. Alone. Urgently. He'd said, a mistake the Corvo family is about to make. I didn't go. Instead, I went back to the ledgers, because that is the only language I have ever fully trusted, and because something about Renzi's urgency felt less like concern and more like a man watching his own timeline collapse. I went through the shipment hit file line by line, the way I'd gone through the settlement paperwork, the way I go through anything, assuming nothing, trusting the numbers over the story attached to them. The false report itself was clean, almost too clean, the kind of clean that told me more than any error would have. Behind it, filed under a code my father hadn't used in 9 years, I found the second ledger, a set of numbers that didn't belong to any Corvo account, routed instead through my own father's old and used freight numbers. 9 years of them. Payments from the Zanetti family, the Corvo's oldest rivals on the harbor, moving quietly through a dead file no one had thought to check twice. Renzi hadn't rescued my family from debt. He'd built the debt, patiently, for 9 years, to guarantee himself a permanent, deniable seat inside Corvo territory, and a marriage, when the moment was right, that would put someone he could still reach on the inside of the one family he'd been selling out the whole time. I sat with that for a long minute, the ledger open on my knees, and felt something that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite rage, the specific, hollow feeling of realizing the person who taught you to trust numbers was the one person who'd been lying with them the whole time. I didn't know it yet, but the clerk who logged archive requests still answered to Renzi first and the Hale name second. 9 years of being the family's trusted hand had bought him more than a signature. It had bought him eyes in every room that mattered, including this one. He called again within the hour. Same warm voice. Same offer of a private meeting at the old harbor office, just the two of us, before this gets out of hand. I thought about walking in there alone with the ledger in my bag, proving I could handle my own family's mess the way I'd been handling it quietly for 9 years. Then I thought about Bruno's face in that floodlit yard, and about how fast a woman with no proof becomes a woman who's guilty by default. I brought the ledger to Damiano instead. He believed me before I finished the sentence. Not because the numbers were obvious, they weren't. Not to anyone who hadn't spent a decade reading contracts for their margins, but because, he told me later, he'd already stopped believing the version of events where I was the danger the day I stood in a floodlit yard and named a scar instead of an alibi. Renzi must have felt the ground shift, because he moved faster than any of us expected. That same night, he came to the loading yard himself, with 2 of the men who worked the docks under him, not to talk, but to make sure the accusation stuck to me before anyone could read the second ledger and understand what he'd actually built. I won't describe every second of what happened in that yard. I'll tell you what mattered, that Renzi's voice, once so careful and warm, cracked into something ugly and cornered the moment his own men hesitated to follow his orders. That Damiano put himself between me and a raised gun without a single word of hesitation, that my ribs ached for days afterward from being pulled hard and fast behind a stack of shipping containers, not from anything worse than that. The floodlights buzzed overhead the whole time, indifferent, the same lights that had shown me his scar the night everything finally locked into place. I remember the smell of salt and diesel, sharper than usual, the way fear seems to turn up every sense at once. Nobody in that yard fired a shot that landed. It was close enough that I felt the fear in my knees for a week, and that was enough. By the time it was over, Renzi was on the ground, disarmed, and the 2 men who'd come with him were already backing away from a fight that had never been theirs to have. The real reckoning happened 3 days later, in a room I'd never been allowed into before, a long table, dark wood gone soft with age. The harbor's old allied families gathered around it the way they must have gathered for 100 years before I was born. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody needed to. The room itself seemed to understand that this was where things got decided permanently. Damiano laid the second ledger down in front of them without a single raised word, and let it sit there a moment before he spoke, the way you let a jury look at evidence before you tell them what it means. 9 years of Zanetti money, he said, routed through a Hale family account. Victor Renzi assumed no one would ever check twice. My wife checked it. He didn't look at me when he said it, but I felt every head at that table turn my way anyway, and for the first time since the signing table, being looked at didn't feel like being weighed. Then he took the original debt contract, the fraudulent one, the one that had cost my father 9 years of his life, and burned it in a shallow dish at the center of the table, in front of every family whose respect had ever mattered to the Corvo name. That was the custom, I learned. Not a lawsuit. Not a call to the police. A debt declared void, in fire, in front of witnesses who would remember it happened. One of the older men at the table, gray at the temples, a signet ring worn thin with age, asked what Damiano intended for Renzi. Exile, Damiano said. Not a grave. A man like that survives better as a warning walking around than a story people stop telling. Renzi wasn't killed. He was stripped of the protection that had let him move freely on the harbor for 2 decades and put out of it for good, exiled from every door that had ever opened for him because of the Corvo name. It felt, strangely, like more of a sentence than a bullet would have been. Renzi had sat at our table for 10 years, and it took 9 days to undo him. My father didn't speak much for 2 days after the council meeting. Learning that the man who'd sat at our table for 10 years was the one who'd built the wound in the first place isn't something any ledger entry can absorb. But when he finally looked at Damiano again, across our own kitchen table, he didn't see a collector anymore. He saw the man who'd pulled his daughter out of a burning car once, and out of a mafia accountant's frame-up a second time. There was a cost to all of it, and I want to be honest about that too. Because a debt that gets forgiven still leaves a mark on the ledger where it used to be. My father's business survived, but not as his. Within the year, Hale Freight would be folded fully into Corvo Shipping, the name on the door changed, the independence my father had spent 30 years building gone the way debts go when someone finally, actually pays them off. I saved the thing I loved by losing the one part of it that had always been only ours. The last time I stood in the harbor office, going through the old records properly for the first time in 9 years, the diesel and paper smell was the same as it had always been, but I noticed it differently now, not as the smell of a debt that never shrank, but as the smell of a room I'd finally been allowed to finish. I found the cleared ledger page, the real one, the one that had exonerated me, refiled where it should have been refiled all along. I'd written it myself, in my own hand, my married name beside my father's company, for the first time as something I'd chosen to write, not something I'd been told to sign. Damiano's hand came to rest over mine on the page. The raven scar lay against my knuckles, warm, familiar in a way that still didn't feel entirely real. Outside, through the office's single window, the harbor was doing what it always did, cranes turning, gulls scattering off a container roof, the ordinary machinery of a life that had almost cost me everything and had somehow, instead, given me the one thing I never thought to put in a ledger. Neither of us said anything else. We didn't need to. I used to think love was just another kind of debt, paid down slowly and never quite closed. I don't think that anymore. Some debts get burned in front of witnesses, and some get paid in a scar you trace blind. If you'd found out the man who once saved your life was the same man your family owed everything to, would you have signed that contract? or run from it.